Life Stories presents a tale of unexpected emotions, desire, and the complexities of human relationships. In this story, a successful billionaire, James, finds his world turned upside down when an accidental encounter with his maid, Emily, sparks an attraction he never anticipated. As his feelings grow stronger, the boundaries of employer and employee blur, leading to a series of difficult decisions and emotional turmoil. Can James control his emotions? Or will they get the better of him? Join us as we explore this powerful story of self-control, empathy, and the painful lessons life has to offer. Don't forget to subscribe to begin today's story with Life Stories. James adjusted his silk robe as he walked down the hall toward his bathroom, the gentle hum of his phone in his hand barely registering in his mind. His thoughts were consumed with the business meetings he'd attended that day, the numbers, the deals, the strategy for the week ahead. Yet, as he pushed open the bathroom door, everything in his mind seemed to freeze, as if time itself had hit pause. A loud gasp pierced the air, followed by a startled scream that bounced off the polished marble walls. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Emily's voice trembled with shock, her eyes wide with panic. She stood there, a towel clutched tightly against her body, the thin fabric barely concealing her form. I stood frozen, caught between confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite understand. Emily, the maid who had worked for me for over a year, stood before me, her skin glistening from the hot water still dripping from her, her hair wet and curling around her face. The steam from the shower swirled in the air, making the scene almost surreal, as though it were a dream, or a moment that wasn't meant to be real. I should have turned away, should have apologized and left immediately. But something stopped me. I could hear the quickened beat of my heart, the rush of air as I inhaled deeply. But the words didn't come. All I could focus on was the wide, brown eyes that stared back at me in shock and fear. I felt a strange knot in my stomach. Why didn't I just walk away? I'm sorry, I finally managed, my voice unsteady. I didn't know anyone was in here. Emily tightened the towel around herself, her face flushed with embarrassment, her body stiff as she looked at me, desperate to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "I thought you were out, sir," she said, her words barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder would somehow make the moment worse. I took a small step back, my body shifting uncomfortably. "I should go," I muttered, my throat dry, my mind reeling. I turned to leave, but before I could step out, something about the whole encounter lingered in my mind. I had seen Emily many times before, seen her, yes, but never like this. Never this close, never so exposed. There was something different about her now, something that I couldn't quite place. As Emily hurried past me and disappeared down the hallway, I closed the bathroom door behind me, leaning against it with a sharp exhale, trying to steady myself. What was that? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. I turned on the sink and splashed cold water on my face, hoping the icy chill would cool the fire that had unexpectedly ignited inside me. But even as the water ran down my face, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. Emily, her skin had been so smooth, so radiant, like polished mahogany under the droplets of water. The way her towel had clung to her body, barely covering the delicate curves I had never noticed before. It wasn't just the shock of the moment, something inside me had shifted. And now I couldn't stop thinking about her. What was wrong with me? I ran a hand over my face, trying to clear the thoughts from my mind. She was just my maid, just an employee, someone I had barely spoken to beyond the simplest of instructions. Yet, now, all I could think about was the way her body had moved, the way she had looked at me. I sighed in frustration, drying my face with a towel as if that would somehow erase the image that had been burned into my mind. I had been in control of everything, my business, my life, my decisions, until now. But this feeling was different. Dangerous, even. I left the bathroom and walked down the hallway, my heart still pounding, my body tense. As I approached the dining area, Kamau, my butler, greeted me. "Sir, would you like your coffee now?" I blinked, momentarily confused, before nodding. "Yes, coffee, sure." I sat down at the dining table, my toast untouched, my mind far from the meal in front of me. I had never been one to mix business with pleasure. I was too disciplined, too focused on the bigger picture to allow distractions. But something about Emily, something about the way she held herself, so reserved yet so undeniable, had shattered that control. She wasn't trying to impress me. She wasn't throwing herself at me like other women had done. No, Emily was different. She was quiet, composed, and I found myself intrigued, my curiosity gnawing at me with every passing second. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I had lost control. The powerful businessman I prided myself on being was slipping away. And it was all because of her, the woman who, for over a year, had merely been a figure in my peripheral vision. Now, she was front and center. And I was powerless to push her away. I gripped my coffee cup tightly, trying to steady my nerves. This was dangerous. This wasn't something I could let continue. But already, I could feel it, a pull, a force drawing me closer to her. And I wasn't sure I could stop myself. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything, least of all work. The numbers on the screen in my office were a haze, a sea of digits that no longer held any meaning. My mind kept drifting back to the encounter in the bathroom. Emily's face, her shock, the way she had tightened her grip on that towel, it all replayed in my head like a broken record. I had been with many women before, but none had ever made me feel like this. None had ever made my pulse race with just a glance. It was irrational. It was ridiculous. And yet, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling. I sighed, rubbing my temples as I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cold emptiness of my office. The air felt thick with tension, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Nothing had changed. Nothing other than the fact that I could no longer ignore the way Emily made me feel. I couldn't help but wonder if she had sensed it too. Her demeanor had changed slightly since that moment. She was more reserved, more careful around me, as though she too had become aware of the unspoken tension between us. She still kept her distance. But there was something in the way she moved, in the way her eyes flicked away whenever I caught her gaze. I couldn't deny that I noticed it. Her movements were so graceful, so effortless. Even when she was simply carrying out her duties, I found myself watching her. The way she bent over to pick something up. The way her hair would fall just slightly out of place, making her look even more beautiful than before. I caught myself thinking about her more often than I'd like to admit. It wasn't just attraction, it was fascination. I wanted to know more about her, to understand who she really was beyond the uniform. She had worked for me for over a year, but all I had ever known about her was her name, her quiet efficiency, and her impeccable work ethic. But now, I wanted to know the things that didn't show up in a resume. I wanted to know what made her tick, what made her laugh, what kept her up at night. I wasn't sure why this fascination had taken root in me, but I couldn't deny that it was there. And it was getting stronger with every passing minute. I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. I had to talk to her, to acknowledge what was happening between us. But what would I say? How would I explain this feeling without crossing the line? I wasn't sure I could even put it into words. Just as I was getting lost in my thoughts, the door to my office creaked open, and Emily stepped in. She was back in her usual uniform, a simple, modest blue dress with a white apron, and her face was composed. Her eyes focused on the task at hand. "Sir, I came to clean your office," she said, keeping her gaze down, her voice calm and polite, as though nothing had happened between us. I cleared my throat, struggling to focus on her words. "Go ahead," I managed, trying to sound composed, as though my heart wasn't pounding in my chest. As she moved around the room, dusting the shelves and organizing the papers on my desk, I found myself unable to look away. It was like a magnet pulling at me, forcing me to watch her every move, the way her dress clung to her waist, the way her delicate hands moved as she worked. Everything about her seemed to draw me in. I clenched my jaw, frustrated with myself. This was ridiculous. I was acting like a schoolboy with a crush, unable to focus on anything other than her. "Are you all right, sir?" Emily asked, glancing at me with a hint of concern. I inhaled sharply, trying to steady myself. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice a little more strained than I had intended. She nodded and went back to her work, completely unaware of the effect she was having on me. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't something I could ignore for much longer. As she finished and walked toward the door, I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "Emily," I said, my voice unsteady. She turned, her brown eyes meeting mine. "Yes, sir?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I wanted to ask her more about herself, to learn who she was beyond the maid in the blue dress. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. "Not yet." "Never mind," I muttered, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. She gave me a small nod and left the room, closing the door behind her. I exhaled a long breath, leaning back in my chair. This was going to be a problem. A big problem. For the first time in my life, I was completely out of control. And the woman who had caused it? Emily. The days following that encounter were a blur of emotions, none of which I could quite process. My thoughts were consumed by Emily. Her presence, her smile, and the way she had looked at me in the brief moments we had shared. Every time she walked into a room, I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart race just a little faster, and my mind falter. It wasn't just attraction anymore, it was something deeper, more complicated, and harder to ignore. At work, I found myself distracted in a way I had never been before. The numbers, the charts, and the endless meetings all seemed irrelevant compared to the whirlwind of thoughts that swirled in my mind. It was impossible to concentrate. Emily had invaded every corner of my thoughts, and it seemed I couldn't escape her. I tried to keep a professional distance, to remind myself that she was my employee, nothing more, but the more I tried to suppress the feelings, the stronger they became. I was fighting a battle within myself, torn between what I knew was right and what my heart seemed to want. It was becoming unbearable. And then, one afternoon, as I sat in my office, working through some paperwork, I heard the soft tap of knuckles against the door. I looked up to see Emily standing there, her face composed, her eyes lowered in respect. She had returned to her usual uniform, the simple blue dress and white apron that had always defined her role. "Sir," she said, her voice calm and polite. "I came to clean your office." I nodded, unable to hide the unease that tightened in my chest. "Go ahead," I said, trying to sound casual, but failing. As she moved around the room, I watched her with the same intensity as before. There was something about the way she moved, the way she was so methodical in her work, that kept me rooted in place. Her presence had a quiet power over me, one I couldn't understand, but couldn't escape either. She was a force, and I was powerless in her orbit. She bent down to pick up a book from the floor, and for a moment, I found myself unable to look away. The way her dress clung to her body, the delicate curve of her waist, it was too much. I had never thought of her like this before, never allowed myself to consider her in any other light than as my maid. A woman doing her job. But now, everything had changed. "Sir, are you all right?" Emily's voice broke through my thoughts, her eyes flicking up to meet mine with a hint of concern. I quickly looked away, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm fine," I muttered, my voice strained. "Go ahead." She nodded, but I could see the faintest trace of suspicion in her eyes. She finished her work quickly and moved toward the door, her back straight, her gaze firmly on the floor. Before she could leave, I spoke again, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. "Emily," I said, my voice low. She turned, her eyes meeting mine. "Yes, sir?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say to her? How could I explain the confusion I was feeling? The emotions that had taken root deep inside me? I wasn't sure I could. "Never mind," I said, the words feeling hollow, even to my own ears. She gave me a small nod and left the room without another word, closing the door quietly behind her. I sat there for a long time, my mind racing. This wasn't just an attraction anymore, it was becoming an obsession. Something that I couldn't ignore. No matter how hard I tried, I was losing control, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. As I sat there, the weight of my thoughts pressing on me, I realized something important. This wasn't just about desire. It wasn't just about the way she looked or the way she made me feel in those brief moments of contact. It was about something deeper, something real. Emily had somehow managed to pierce the armor I had built around myself. And now, I had to face it. The question was, would I allow myself to fall? Or would I retreat before it was too late? But I knew deep down that it was already too late. As the days passed, the tension between Emily and I only grew. It was as if we were caught in an unspoken dance. Both of us aware of the shifting dynamic but too afraid to address it. I could feel the weight of my feelings pressing down on me. And every time I saw her, I struggled to maintain control. One evening, after the house had quieted down, I found myself in the sitting room, staring at the flames flickering in the fireplace. My thoughts, as they always did, turned to Emily, her face, her smile, the way she made me feel. Everything about her seemed to haunt me. But I couldn't act on it. She was my maid, and I was her employer. There were lines that could never be crossed, no matter how strong the attraction. That night, as I sat alone in my office, I heard a knock on the door. It was Emily, standing there with a tray of tea in her hands. She placed it on my desk, her movements graceful and quiet. As she turned to leave, I called out to her. "Emily," I said, my voice soft. She paused, her back to me, her shoulders tensing slightly. "Yes, sir?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I think we need to forget everything that happened. It's not something we can pursue. It's too complicated, and I don't want to make things difficult for you." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was a brief flicker of understanding. Then, she nodded, her expression calm. "I understand, sir." As she left the room, I felt a weight lift from my chest. But at the same time, something inside me broke. The feelings I had for Emily would never go away. But I knew that some things, no matter how strong, were never meant to be. And that, in itself, was a lesson, a painful but necessary lesson in life. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the latest videos from Life Stories.